Hello and welcome. You're listening to CIH Futures Guide to the Housing Sector. Futures is the Chartered Institute of Housing's network for young professionals in the housing sector. In this podcast series, we introduce and explore key topics and issues facing the sector today and how you can get involved. To find out more about Futures and what the CIH can do for you, you can visit cih.org.
Hello and welcome to CIH Futures Guide to the Housing Sector podcast. My name is Catherine George. I am a member of CIH Futures and I am also a neighbourhood management officer for South Liverpool Homes Housing Association. It's fair to say that it was a surprise to the whole country when Rishi Sunak announced a general election was to be held on the 4th of July 2024. Politics is important throughout the year, but those important issues are especially thrust into the spotlight whenever an election is called. Arguably none more important than housing, as it is so deeply connected with many other social and welfare issues affecting the country today. Indeed, housing is a central topic in all of the major parties' manifestos, with Labour, the Tories and Lib Dems all pledging, amongst other things, to ban no-fault evictions, pledged to reform or end the leasehold system, and pledged to build at least 1.5 million homes over the next Parliament. And yet, recent polling suggests that 40% of voters believe political parties just do not focus enough on housing. Today, I'm joined by Rachael Williamson, who is the Head of Policy at the Chartered Institute of Housing, to discuss all things general election and the important role that CIH plays during this crucial time for the country. So hello and welcome, Rachael. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to work within the policy space in the housing sector?
Well, hi, Catherine. Great to be with you this morning and be on the other side of the podcast table, so to speak. I joined CIH, just for anyone who doesn't know me, end of 2021 as Head of Policy and External Affairs. And before that worked in government for most of my career, and chose to come and work in housing, having perhaps accidentally fallen into it, as many people do, but chose to stay in it because I think it's an absolutely great place to work, and it's a really exciting time in the run-up to an election to be talking about housing.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of us do fall into housing, don't we? But I think it's really great that you've said that you've chosen to work in housing as well, and you've chosen to stay in the sector. And obviously, we're delighted to have you still here with us. Could you introduce Chartered Institute of Housing to us and what the body is?
So Chartered Institute of Housing, or CIH for short, is effectively the UK body for housing professionals and actually has an international reach as well. We've got over 17,000 members, and you might be a member with us because you're starting out your career in housing, right through to people that might have retired but still have an interest in it, and we're here to support people. We have, as part of our chartered status, we have a focus on public interest. So some of our work, for example, in the housing rights space, is very focused on particularly helping people that might not always have a lot of voice. We're not a trade body, that's important to say. So we're here to understand and play back member concerns, but we're a membership body with a public interest focus. A huge part of what we do is education and training. Obviously, lots of work in the qualification space at the moment with a growing focus on professionalism, and I work in the policy and external affairs space where we're ultimately trying to help drive positive change in the housing sector.
That's great. Thank you for explaining that to us, Rachael. So a bit of a meaty question next, but what is the election and why is it so important if you work within the housing sector?
So the general election on the 4th of July is obviously one of those things that comes around every sort of 4 or 5 years. I remember my first one when I got a chance to vote was the 97 election, with that changeover from Conservative government to Labour government. We might perhaps be heading for another big change like that on the 4th, we'll see. But for those working in housing, or indeed any other sector, it's a real opportunity to be trying to get the issues that you care about on the agenda. And we can see housing very firmly in that top 5 amongst the general public, and indeed in the top 3 for under 25s. So it's an issue that the politicians are talking about. It's very much part of the hustings discussion at the local level and at the national level. I think we'd like it to be more, it's fair to say. Sometimes with these election debates, some things take off. We're seeing, quite a lot of talk in the last week or so around the betting scandal. It would be great, whilst that's obviously an issue, it would be great if we could be talking about things that really are making a difference to people every day. So the airtime doesn't always follow necessarily the kind of evidence and analysis about what's really making a difference or could make a difference to people. But it's a real opportunity for people on a professional level to be engaging with parliamentary candidates or potential new MPs, councillors as well, who are out, canvassing for people's views, and a chance, if you work in social housing, to be really raising the profile of how important it is, to be showing what social housing providers are doing as real kind of community anchor institutions, and perhaps be having conversations with people that you don't normally get to meet with so easily.
Absolutely, yeah. So obviously the CIH, it's a non-political organisation, but it does still get involved in influencing policy and campaigning within the housing space. Could you tell us a little bit more about the CIH's role specifically during the election period?
So perhaps if I can go back slightly and stretch your question, Catherine, to before the election period. So we obviously, with the nature of the parliamentary cycle, we know an election's on the horizon at a certain point. So back in end of September last year, in 23, we published our Homes at the Heart strategy and our 10-point plan for housing, alongside many of the sector partners who were starting to put out their manifestos, and indeed, some are still publishing them as we speak now. So we have been planning ahead for the election, as you say, in a non-party political way, but very much we're very evidence-led. So looking at what does the evidence tell us, what's our analysis of the challenges, and most importantly then, what do we think some of the solutions might be. So the 10-point plan that we published was focused on more homes and better homes, and 10 very kind of concrete areas and actions that the next government could take, of whichever party, to really try and move the dial from what is currently, I think we have to agree, a housing emergency. And so throughout that time, and as we speak now, we've been working with member input, because we're a member body, as you say, with fantastic range of housing professionals working across England and wider UK with our devolved nation partners. We've been talking to them and thinking about, well, what would make a difference? What then needs investment of money and time, of regulation, and being clear about that. Some things can be done quickly, some will take longer. And that's why overall the sector is coming together to call for a long-term plan for housing, because really one of the things that has been most notably missing is stability, is clarity of purpose. We've had, I think it's 16 housing ministers since 2010. It's then no wonder that the sector's a bit confused, and particularly colleagues working in planning have had a very difficult time of it. So the absence of mandatory housing targets, the stop-start nature of planning reform, the on-off tap in a funding sense, has led us to where we are now, with supply dropping and in turn homelessness and housing need increasing, and the next government needs to do something about that.
Agreed. You mentioned a little bit there about the CIH's 10-point plan, and I have read over it. Many members probably have. Obviously, it's very detailed, and it's all about how the government create more and better homes, including where it believes investment is most needed. Could you go into a little bit more detail about this for us? Tell us a little bit more about how it was created, and a little bit more about what's in that plan.
Yeah. So we have in CIH, we have a range of different policy networks. So for any members listening that aren't aware, all the information's on our website, but we talk to members all the time, as you know, Catherine, through conversations we might have with Futures, through to conversations with our regional groups, and then our specific policy network. So all the time we're kind of understanding what people are seeing and feeling and what would make a difference. And we also have a policy advisory committee that in particular helped us as we decided what to focus on, because of course there's lots of things we could ask for, and you have to give a bit of thought to, well, what's going to make most sense for CIH to be specifically putting its kind of voice and focus to. And we were very conscious that we wanted to be calling for more homes and more truly affordable homes, but it's not just a numbers game, as we all know. It's also about helping the sector to drive up the standard, the quality, the service for people living in homes now, and not just in the social housing sector, privately owned, privately rented. We're a member body looking at how we can improve housing for everybody. And so our starting point with strategy and the 10-point plan was to almost just step back and say, why does the home matter? what's its role as a sort of economic and social foundation in life, and just that growing acceptance, I think, which we're seeing, which is fantastic, just the importance of home, what you get when you have it, and the impact of not having it. So the fact that at the moment we have record numbers of people who are without a secure home. I think it's 1 in 23 children now in London in temporary accommodation, enough children, I think, across England to fill the equivalent of 5,000 classrooms are currently in temporary accommodation. Of course, temporary doesn't necessarily mean temporary as we might understand it. So it's absolutely very real, the crisis right now. And as we're speaking, people are living in very, very insecure accommodation. At the same time, there's some fantastic examples of brilliant social housing and of people happily renting privately and owning their home. So it's not all bleak, but we need to learn from what's working well and why is it working well, but absolutely shine a light with our public interest focus as a chartered body on where things have gone wrong and how we can make that better. And there's a bit of segmentation work around that, because some people from the most vulnerable in society are absolutely paying the price for effectively a sort of breakdown of social contract, I would argue, when it comes to people's right to adequate housing. And it's particularly that next generation that, if we don't do something about it quickly, are going to see, a long-term impact because of the impact it has on education and health and social mobility. So I think the economic case is made, social value case is made. These are the kind of bigger picture points we were trying to land in our documents, that it's housing not in isolation, it's housing as a route to economic growth, which is certainly how the Labour Party seem to be positioning it. It's about recognising if you haven't got a safe, secure, affordable home within reach of employment, then you start to see schools closing. You see employers not able to actually recruit. I've heard of a number of stories, particularly in expensive coastal areas, where people take a job, but then, in principle, take a job, but then don't actually follow through with it because they actually can't afford to live anywhere. A functioning society needs people that have affordable, secure housing as a sort of foundation in life. So whether your focus is on the sort of the ethics and the social value of that, or the pure fiscal approach, the case is made. The challenge is, there's lots going on in other areas: health and social care, transport, NHS. I think for us and for others who are trying to advocate for change and investment, which is often what it comes down to, it's about being able to position housing in that wider context. And if we just talk about housing as a silo, we won't get the cut through. We need to look at housing and how investment in supported housing, for example, can help take pressure off other, health and social care services, and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of this is about working in partnership.
Yeah, I think we mentioned in our introduction about how closely housing is related to those social and welfare issues that do affect everyone in society. Everyone needs a home to live in. Everyone needs a safe, secure home, like you said. And I think we've definitely had some major housing news stories, haven't we, over the years, in terms of, recent years, I should say, in terms of Grenfell, the tragic case of Awab Ishaq. So it is important that we are getting that investment and buy-in from government at a local and national level to help us create a better sector for everyone and help us create those homes. Thank you for going into so much detail about that, Rachel. I think just to move on slightly, given that the CIH operates across the UK, where housing is a devolved issue, and given the amount of different stakeholders that you've mentioned that you work with and that are impacted by policy change within the sector, I suppose I have two questions. Do you feel the promises laid out in each of the parties' manifestos are enough at the minute? Is there anything in a general sense that you'd like to see? And what role do devolved bodies have during a general election, and how do the CIH support them with the work that they do?
Yeah, great question or questions. So I think looking at the manifestos as a whole, and for any members listening, we have produced a What You Need to Know handy guide. So we've summarised what's in it and what's in them from a housing perspective and what we think of them. Broadly speaking, I guess it's fair to say of the main parties, Labour and the Lib Dems and Green have got some really ambitious proposals for housing across 10 years, and a big focus on building more social homes, which is really encouraging to see. The challenge, of course, with all of that is there some more money coming through to help deliver on that? Because targets are great, and planning reform and all the things that might help with the levers, but you do need money too, and that one I think is not quite clear yet. So I think, in the Conservative manifesto, lots of focus, probably not surprisingly, on home ownership, on helping first-time buyers with the revived Help to Buy scheme, although not as big as they've had before. There's a reference to a renewed affordable homes programme, so that's good. But the only real reference to social housing is in the context of reforming social housing allocations, which was something they'd consulted on not long before the election was called, also referred to as British Homes for British Workers, and that's something we'd expressed some concern on in the sort of the premise on which that policy was starting out from. What problem was it really trying to solve? Probably not time to go into that one now, but we've certainly put some stuff out on it if anyone wants to take a look. The Reform Party, which is the other of the sort of the five that are being considered in the main party manifestos, I think it's fair to say isn't talking about much in the space that our listeners would probably be interested in, and questionable assertions made, I think, around the diagnosis of the problems and then possible solutions. I won't give that one so much airtime. I think overall it's good to see housing and energy efficiency, decarbonisation feature prominently throughout many of them, and we can see many of the asks in our 10-point plan reflected, as well as the analysis of the problems. So that's really encouraging, and obviously that shows how much not just CIH but lots of other partners, sector organisations have been pushing really hard to get housing on the agenda and really demonstrate the importance and the evidence behind that. So that's really good. I think that's a real win for the sector. But of course, we've had so-called housing elections in the past. It doesn't always translate into kind of measurable action when you fast forward to the next election. So we have to continue to watch that, I think. I think the challenge, as I say, is the money. How is this all going to be paid for? The only time that we have delivered the kind of scale of, if I talk about social housing, that we've needed as a country has been after the Second World War, when councils played a really, really big role in doing that. Councils are going to need a lot of help, and that's going to include looking at their financial settlements. As many people listening will know, council finances are not in a great place for all sorts of different reasons, and the amount of money currently being spent on temporary accommodation at the moment has absolutely skyrocketed. So at the moment we've got money that's coming in through taxpayers and going back out again, that's effectively going into subsidising people living in often poor quality or temporary accommodation, when that money could arguably be spent on boosting supply. And we've done work on that, as have others, to show the value of it. But there's a conscious decision has to be made to put some money in up front to save some of that money down the line. And of course, that's a challenge for any government that's trying to operate within very tight kind of fiscal spend. We certainly, in terms of just looking at what is in and not in the manifestos, although sometimes because something's not in doesn't mean that the party, if they're in government, isn't very mindful of it. You can't put everything in, but we'd certainly like to see more on the role of supported housing, which is a really important part of the sector and how it supports in the social housing space, and has been really in a very challenging position for a very long time. And if something isn't done about that soon, we will be having the same kind of conversation that we're having around temporary accommodation. So we also call for a review of the social security system. There's not a huge amount in there. SNP, Scottish National Party, saying more in that space and wanting to devolve housing benefit, that kind of thing. I think, as we said, we can't talk about housing in isolation, and there's a massive interplay between the so-called sort of safety net, social security safety net, which I think is fair to say it's not really a safety net for many anymore, and how that interacts with housing spend and affordability pressures. So we would really like to see more in that space. And also, I think there's talk about building safety in the context of leaseholders, and that's really important, but wider pressures on the sector for building safety remediation. There's a continued pressure that effectively means tenants could be left picking up the bill, where housing associations are having to spend money on building safety issues that were not of their making. And I think that's an issue that's going to run and run, as is the wider pressure of making sure homes now and in the future are fit for purpose. So when we think about a new decent home standard, which we expect is coming on down the track, and minimum energy efficiency standards, which in principle we're committed to in the Social Housing Regulation Act, there's a lot more coming at the sector that involves money being spent. And where does the money come from? We can't expect it all to come through from tenant rent. So I think these are conversations we need to be having with whoever forms the next government. But overall, we want to just be making sure we're working in partnership. And there's certainly plenty of sort of positives in a reasonable number of the manifestos to be having, building those conversations from, and a lot of ambition in there to work with, which is really encouraging. And the question was on devolves as well, wasn't it? Sorry, that was a long answer, so I forgot what I forgot the second one. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Catherine. So I'm head of policy and external affairs for England. We have separate directors leading work in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we have a lot happening now in Republic of Ireland as well. And the election on the 4th is obviously a UK general election, so it won't directly affect how the devolved nation governments deliver their services where they have devolved powers, and housing's a devolved issue. But investment in England means investment everywhere through the so-called Barnett consequential. So if there's more money spent on social housing in England, that will translate into more money that can be spent on social housing in the devolved nations. And that point on social security that I made, that's one. Welfare remains within Westminster's remit. So our calls in that space for a review of social security, and which we think, if that was done kind of at least independently, would start looking at, should there be a 2-child benefit cap, which we've called for that to go, bedroom tax, local housing allowance pegged as a minimum at the 30th percentile and uprated every year. You'd be looking at all of that, and that would have a wider UK reach. But the devolved directors are kind of leading the conversations in the nations. But the 10-point plan that we produced, we worked on together, and we have a sort of cover to it, if people haven't seen, that explains what does this mean in a devolved context.
Please don't apologise for talking. We love to hear it. We love to see it. That's brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. That was really in depth and really helpful. I suppose then, just moving the conversation on a little bit, how can CIH members get involved with the work that CIH does during the election? And looking forward as well to when we do know who's going to be in the next government, what work can we do, I suppose, to help you with what you're doing and in our day-to-days as well?
Yeah, great. Well, that's always a great question. So we love it when we hear from members and people are keen to engage with us. And as I mentioned at the start, we have a range of policy and practice networks. They're growing all the time. So we just set one up, for example, that met for the first time last week on social security. We've got groups on assets and repairs, on antisocial behaviour, the supported housing network, net zero, kind of. I won't try and list them all now. So if anyone's listening and is a member and not plugged into those and would like to be, please have a look at our website. All the details are on there. Drop me a line and I'll put you in touch. That's an ongoing one. And as I mentioned, we're very quickly, already now thinking about what's that first letter going to say to whoever the next Secretary of State is for whichever department that we have a link in with. We're talking to officials all the time. Of course, they don't change with the government, so that conversation continues. We're advertising at the moment actually for a few new members to join our policy advisory committee, which I mentioned earlier, played a big role in us developing the manifesto, the 10-point plan. So if anyone's listening and would be interested in that, the details of that are on our website too. People can reach out to me. Regional groups are a fantastic way to get involved too. So we've got regional groups across England, and that's a great way to get involved, building your network locally. But we talk about policy in that space too. They often run events that might be just for local members or might have a wider reach. So actually the East Midlands group is running one on net zero next month. So there's loads that people can get involved with. We also run webinars fairly regularly. We have conferences, and of course the Housing Community Summit in Liverpool in September is going to absolutely be the place to be. The first cross-sector housing conference post-election, where we'll expect to be hearing from the new leaders in the housing space, and really being able to take a bit of time to step back and think. So we know where we are now in terms of the new government. So what does that first few months, year, parliamentary term look like? We're not waiting till the results on the 5th of July to work out what we want to be saying and asking for. That work has already started, and we'd love to hear from anyone listening if they would like to be more involved in that. We've also got a general election member toolkit on the website, so if anyone hasn't seen some of the stuff that you and I have talked about just now is on there. We've got more detail on our sort of top policy lines. We've got ways in which you can see who's standing in your area, ways to get involved. If there's anything that's not on there that you think you would have liked to have seen, let me know. We can always see if we can add it in. And the other thing I'll just give a plug to for anyone listening back, whether you're a member or not, that might be useful. We've run a series of webinars with Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Frameworks UK on how to talk about homes. And sometimes I think people maybe just don't always have confidence to have that conversation, whether it's professionally or personally. Once you start talking to someone who might be knocking on your door, asking for your vote, or just talking to family members about how do you make the case for social homes, how do you talk about housing in the context of homelessness prevention and poverty, how do you talk about private renting in a way that just helps to, talk about it in a constructive, meaningful, purposeful way. So there's a fantastic range of materials that have been put together that people can access, and our webinars can be watched back or listened back to. So just a plug for that one as well.
Yeah, definitely the general election toolkit. It is really useful. Anyone listening, please do go and check that out, because certainly, like you've just mentioned, Rachel, it helps frame conversations both personally and professionally. And even after the general election has come and gone, I do think that those resources will still be really valuable. And obviously, just a little plug for CIH Futures as well. We're one of the boards working with CIH for young professionals. We're trying to get housing as a career of choice as well. So please do reach out to either myself or anyone else on the Futures board if that's something that you would be interested in getting involved in. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think we've had some really interesting discussion around what the CIH does during an election, around the 10-point plan and detailed analysis of policy as to be expected from yourself. Do you have any final thoughts at all that you'd like to share?
I guess I would just say, well, number one, make sure you go and vote on the 4th of July, unless you've done a postal vote in advance. And please encourage everybody that you know to vote. I think there is a lot of kind of doom-mongering and fatalism sometimes when we talk about politics or when we talk about housing, because it's difficult. It's been difficult for a long time. But I think as much as possible, just a plea to let's try and talk about it positively, focus on solutions, think about how we can be part of the change that we want to see. If that doesn't sound too cheesy, I think we're in a fantastic place as housing professionals working with, whoever forms the next government. Housing is going to be on the agenda. We need to move quickly to be reaching out to whoever the next MP will be in anyone's given area, inviting them to come and see what you're doing if you're working in a housing space. Lots of opportunity to be trying to focus on how do we make sure that positive change happens and happens quickly. And if anyone feels they need any more support to do that, then obviously reach out to us at CIH. That's what we're here for.
I think brilliant to end on an optimistic note as well. And absolutely, yes, make sure that you're getting out and exercising your right to vote on the 4th of July to have your voice heard. Well, if you found this podcast interesting and if you would like any further information on what we've discussed today, please do reach out to one of us at CIH or on the boards. Look on the website, especially the General Election Toolkit. As I say, that's really valuable and useful. And any links as well that we will put in the description box below to make getting to those pages easier. So yeah, thank you for listening, and make sure that you tune in to the next Futures podcast.
Thanks so much, Catherine.